Well, hello everyone. Welcome to InfoGuard Atlanta, our conference, our webinar conference. We're excited to have so many people join us. Today's topic will be a recap of RSA Conference 2016, and we'll be discussing 7 key takeaways that you can use today. Before we begin, I'd like to just make a couple of different disclaimers. Firstly, a little bit about InfoGuard. We're a partnership between the FBI and the private sector. It's a fantastic association, and if we have folks on the line today who are not members of InfoGuard, we encourage you to go to infoguard.org and join. There's no charge to join InfoGuard, and there's local chapters pretty much all over the country. Quick disclaimer that the views and the contents and opinions of the webinar are solely that of the speakers and other contributors. They don't represent necessarily the opinions or represent InfoGuard or InfoGuard Atlanta Members Alliance. And we're also not affiliated with RSA Conference 2016. We're just commentating on some things that we heard at the conference and some themes that emerged from the conference. So without further ado, I want to welcome our first panelist, my friend Joe Dyer. Joe, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. As Trevor said, I'm Joe Dyer. I'm the CISO for ICF International. ICF has a little over 5,000 employees. We're in the government as well as commercial sector with over 70 offices worldwide. We provide management and professional services, provide technology solutions in the areas of energy, health, environmental, infrastructure, public safety, and also social programs. I'm responsible ultimately providing and maintaining the oversight of the ICF International Information Security Program, which include an array of areas from policy to threat prevention, forensics, as well as incident response and threat communications.
Great. Thank you, Joe, and thank you for being on the webinar. We're also joined today by my friend Ward Piles. Ward, why don't you say hello to our audience and a few words about your background?
Yeah, thank you, Trevor. Hi, everyone. Great to have you all join us today. My name is Ward Piles. I'm the manager of security risk and governance for Home Depot. Home Depot, I'm sure many of you are aware, is a large retailer here in the U.S. and covering all of North America. We've got about 350,000 employees and an infrastructure that spans the globe. My past has been everywhere from the critical infrastructure sector, where I've got to work in alignment with DHS and NIST in the development of the cybersecurity framework, as well as the C2M2 and other maturity models, as well as development out of other opportunities with ISO and expansion of certification programs in the ISA 99.
Great, thanks, Ward. And again, thanks for being on the panel. And lastly, myself, Trevor Horwitz. As many of you know, I've been on this series of webinars in the past. I'm currently the president of InfoGuard Atlanta, and I'm also the CISO for TrustNet. We're a IT security and compliance services company based here in Atlanta, Georgia, and we serve a worldwide client base. And we're also one of the co-sponsors for the webinar today. So thank you, TrustNet. So without further ado, also want to mention some of my cohorts on the Atlanta InfoGuard board, in particular Brian Friedman, who's done a fantastic job getting the word out there, and also to one of my colleagues who's our webinars are, Lawrence Tobin, who spends a lot of time putting these things together, and we appreciate both of your efforts. So a little bit about TrustNet. As I mentioned, we're one of the co-sponsors today, and we provide an array of services, including managed security, compliance for a PCI QSA, penetration testing, security awareness. If you need more information, you can go to our website at trustnetinc.com. We're also sponsored today by the Cybersecurity Summit. Cybersecurity Summit is an exclusive C-level conference series targeting cybersecurity. And we also have a special offer for anyone who's interested in joining the Cybersecurity Summit, which takes place in Atlanta next week. And we have free passes to that event exclusively through this webinar. So if anyone's interested, please go ahead and ping us, and we're happy to pass on that information. So let's talk a little bit about our agenda and sort of the backdrop to our conference today, which is really focused on some themes that emerged from RSA 2016. The conference itself was massive. If folks had been there, they're on the phone today, realized there were like 40,000 plus attendees, more than 500 exhibitors, and about 213,000 square feet of exhibit space. So massive event. I mean, looking back over the last few years, it seems like it's almost doubling in size every couple of years. So there's been massive growth there. The first thing we're going to talk about today is ransomware, and ransomware is on the rise. We'll talk about going back to basics. That we're still playing defense. We'll talk about how the target is expanding, and that target is data. We'll also talk about threat modeling and what's going on in that environment. We'll talk about how you manage breaches from the perspective of building resilience into our environment. And then our next topic is going to be how we can extend our security team by co-opting other parts of the organization. And lastly, we'll cover threat detection and how that will impact the environment going forward for the rest of the year. A couple of FAQs. The presentation will be available after the webinar ends. We'll email a link as soon as the recording is processed. It normally comes out in a day or so. And we love to have these webinars to be interactive. So if you do have questions, please go ahead and send them along to us. We're allocated some time at the end of the presentation for an open Q&A. So go ahead, and there's a chat window on the left of your screen, and send us your topics, and we'll be happy to address them as they come up. So let's talk about our first topic, ransomware. So the first one I'm going to ask is talk to Joe. Joe, tell us a little bit about sort of what tools and technologies and strategies should we be following to avoid ransomware infections?
Sure, absolutely. And let's talk about ransomware a little bit first, right? And the real issue that we're currently facing. And if you take a look at what McAfee says halfway through 2015, it was already a 165% increase and ransomware, and it's growing from that particular point in time. So it's a serious matter that we face right now, and with the phishing vector the way it is right now, this whole idea around the financial motivation behind ransomware is really riding the coattail of that, and causing havoc within organizations. And if you think you can just wish, hope, and avoid the idea around addressing ransomware, the problem is not going to go away. So we have to be prepared, is what I always say. It's not a matter of if it's going to happen, it's just a matter of when. So when we take a look at some of the things that we would do, if there's no magic software package or no magic solution that we can implement to really avoid it. So it goes back to a lot of the basics when we talk about managing information security and how we avoid it. And it starts with everything from patch management to making sure that we're following the appropriate protocols and dealing with emails and don't click the links that we aren't unsure of. So it's all the standard stuff that we would handle phishing today. But there are some other things that we can in fact do that we may not think about on a continual basis. Things like make sure that the firewall component is installed on systems, and ensure that your BitTorrents and your I2Ps are restricted on certain ports. Turn off the remote desktop type of connection. Maybe look at and block binary running in the app's data directory or temporary files, and try to do some type of monitoring and looking at certain extensions to see whether or not there are things like .pdf, .exe, which is a known giveaway that your machine potentially is sitting there in an incubation state that it could potentially get malware itself, or ransomware. So if you don't mind, Trevor, before I get into maybe some of the tools, is it okay maybe if we talk a little statistics?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, fantastic. So if you take a look at, as I mentioned before, the impact of ransomware, let's take a look at the Lockheed ransomware, right? It affected over 90,000 systems daily. So huge impact. If you take a look at the companies who talk about, are we prepared for it? I think this actually came out of the RSA conference, is that 62% of the companies lack the confidence that they are able to confront a ransomware threat. So that puts us in a position by which, if we're not really ready to prevent it, we have to start looking at how we, in turn, deal with the issue. So if we take a look at some of the tools that's available to us, there's not a complete array of tools, but there are products that's kind of built in, maybe some of the tools that we have today that will do some basic file monitoring. So it will look at the MD hashes and look at common files that could potentially have ransomware associated with it. So Trevor, I think I'll end right there and I'll pick up. Maybe in the conversation between all of us and provide some other detail.
So what's your take on this? You're seeing a lot of ransomware in your environments and folks that you know in the industry?
Yeah,
so
I think.
Oh, go ahead, Ward.
Go ahead, Joe.
Ward, I'm sorry. I thought you asked the question again to me. I didn't hear, but go ahead.
Not a problem. Yeah, so I think right now you're actually seeing quite a bit of the news and environmental awareness around ransomware. You've seen it even as close as this past Monday with MedStar Health announcing that they were possibly a subject of ransomware, and then a lot of hospitals, a lot of big impact on healthcare right now, because those are areas that are expected as the customer model goes of being available and being always on and continuously accessible. So ransomware is really focusing on those areas that they can hold someone, and the concentration is what is in your model, what is in your activity and business of that is valuable to an attacker, that is going to say, hey, I can focus on this one system or these handful of systems with basic exploits. Oftentimes with ransomware, the approach is blaming the user or blaming the endpoint, blaming the end user. That is the challenge of the IT system and an IT infrastructure and security, is to focus on concentration on where the risk is and concentration on what are your threats. We'll get into threats a lot today, but that's really where the concentration and focus needs to be, is around ransomware. Understand what your threat is and then focus on the controls that need to be in place on those endpoints, and it's not just an end user exploit from malware or phishing that is the problem. It's around the controls and protections that you have in place to prevent that or avoid it at all costs.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Joe.
I'm sorry. I think Ward makes a good point there when we talk about the ideas around, where is the problem? And so many individuals and organizations think that ransomware is an individual or single endpoint issue, but it goes well beyond that. And some of the considerations that we have to plan for as an organization is that the sophistication of ransomware now is just not attacking the endpoint itself, but it's propagating itself into network systems. In other words, if I am attached to a share, it can also again start encrypting that shares, and we have experienced that, as a matter of fact. The financial commitments that organizations have to deal with, and the productivity loss if they are targeted from a ransomware perspective. And again, as Ward said, it's really impacting the health industry. But what we're seeing a lot more is also in the retail industry. There was just recent reports pertaining to ransomware that they're actually impacting the main production and operation systems from POSs. And there was, again, recent reports that businesses have been shut down for a period of time because their whole process, as far as how they do collections and how they process their merchandise, was actually shut down. So it is a very serious matter and can cause financial hardship to organizations, just not the individual.
All right. We're running a poll right now, and for the folks who just joined us, welcome. And running a poll right now on how organizations rate their ability to defend and respond to ransomware. And I think cautiously optimistic seems to be the most popular vote right now, but you see a lot of organizations, no one's really saying bring it on. I mean, that's a sort of a rarity where folks feel that they're completely ready for it, which I guess is just an indication of how serious the threat is today. A couple of other things just to throw out there in terms of some mitigation strategies, which is really one of the goals of today, is to talk about how we can actually address these things from a practical perspective. And we've listed a bunch of things there. I don't want to sort of reiterate them, but backups clearly are a huge part of this thing, because if you can't manage the prevention side, then at least you have a backup plan which can mitigate the damage once a machine has been infected. And then another thing that I thought was a really smart tip, which was go ahead and set up a Bitcoin account just in case. You don't want to leave things to the last minute. And since the ransomware typically, especially in the CryptoLocker virus in particular, has a time limit associated with it, after which the data really becomes completely inaccessible. You don't want to miss out on that. So having a Bitcoin account or a Bitcoin wallet set up in advance can actually help in that strategy from a mitigation standpoint. All right, moving on to our next topic, which is talking about getting back to basics. And I guess part of this conversation is talking about why we're still playing defense, or the fact that we are having to play defense, but not doing a very good job of it overall. So I'm going to start off with Warden. What recommendations do you have for cybersecurity professionals overall, sort of building their defenses?
Yeah, so this is always an interesting one for me, just purely for the fact that I think the biggest complaint that all cybersecurity professionals often have and practitioners have is focused around we are too concentrated on compliance. We are not taking security into account, or we're not doing enough to take security and a secure posture into account. The main focus of the enterprise and the concentration is around getting our compliance checkbox, meeting the compliance need, meeting the compliance objective, and not going beyond that, or if the desire is to go beyond that, then you're not getting the support and really not having a focus on that. One of the actual discussions at RSA that came up through a bunch of those that have been involved in the federal space and NSA and otherwise, DHS, in the response to state-sponsored economic espionage, they were really focusing on what is the active defense, and active defense of going after the hack back, the concept of you're actually in an event and you've got your defenses up and you're working with your defenses, you're responding, but are you actually, what else can you do, and is it a good idea to do anything else aside from just defend? And there's a big debate about that. There's examples of companies out there that have gotten into legal troubles and have experienced the challenges of taking the attack to the attacker, and trying to prevent it in that way, or at least responding in that way. But you're going across possibly state lines for sure, and then very likely you're going over international waters. So you have a lot of legal implications and challenges that get introduced in there. So there's a wide range of going from just the immediate defense of today and what we're doing and what can be done in addition to compliance, but then thinking even more broadly for those larger enterprises that have a more mature program and more mature security posture, then what else can be done and what else is being looked at in considerations. And with that being said, it's not just about the immediate event of what you're focusing on, where you want to concentrate and do something about, but what is it? What are your threat models? What are your actors? Where are you wanting to protect? Where are your crown jewels? And understanding what your risk posture is throughout the environment. Going back to the last one of understanding where your input points are of the lowest hanging fruit, and then making sure that you not just have the right defense, but then also have the right response activities in place to take the appropriate and immediate action to protect the company, the environment, and the data.
And Joe, one of the things that we see as, in this space with a lot of our clients is, and we've listed a whole bunch of recommendations there in terms of things that, pop up all the time. But I think one of the issues that keeps on cropping up, and it's so basic, is getting software updates and patching in place. Because, at the end of the day, a lot of these vulnerabilities come down to, software vulnerabilities, which vendors are providing patches to. Of course, if it's a zero-day attack, there's obviously no patch, but for the most part, there's patching for a lot of these systems. Do you seeing that as a big issue in your environment, or just trying to keep up with the volume of software out there?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a major driver and a major problem with just not my organization, but with many of the organizations of our size and larger. It's the amount of software and the type of tools that may be available to update that variety of software. So most organizations, if you're dealing with a standard platform, let's say example, Microsoft, they have good mechanisms in place with that. And then we start to deal with third-party type of applications, whether it be Adobe or some of the other ones that don't have built-in infrastructure that could tie in many cases. It presents a problem. An organization has to really work on the details on that, because we see the attack vector is just not going through those major type of applications anymore. They're utilizing, again, the easiest paths to be able to potentially compromise a system. So I think that, again, patch management is a major area and prevention mechanism to ensure that, or minimize the potential risk of getting things we talked about like ransomware and other type of malware. What I make a recommendation in many cases is that technology is changing, but it's just not technology is changing. The threat type and the maturity level also changes. So every once in a while we have to sit back and what I call flip the cybersecurity program upside down, and we really have to take those things and take a look at what our threats are today, and then measure them against on the things that we're doing, and do they still work, right? And that just don't go from the patch management side, but it's everything from vulnerability and pen testing to how we're handling our SIM and intelligent tools, the analytics components of it, and looking at DLP. So it's a lot of different areas that we really have to take a look at and see if it's still working for us today. So what our cyber programs were even 2 years ago, may not match what the organization would need today.
Good
because
point.
of the things you mentioned, greater software growth, things of that nature.
Well, thank you, Joe. Moving on from there, one of the other things that came out of RSA we're going to talk about is how the target is expanding. And one of the talks at RSA, I think it was Bruce Schneier who said this, he spoke about this concept about data being toxic. And I thought it was a great analogy for how organizations need to think about data, and not really looking at data necessarily as being a corporate asset, but how it can actually hurt the organization, which is not typically how we sort of view data. We look at it as being something sort of positive. And obviously big data has had a huge impact in marketing organizations, logistics, and keeping that data has become a prerequisite. But what Bruce Schneier's comments were all about how cybersecurity professionals need to recognize that data can be toxic to the organization. And even innocuous or seemingly innocuous data, such as email addresses, are now a major target for hackers because they're using them for phishing attacks and other more sophisticated type of attacks. So let me go back to you, Joe, and ask you, how should organizations be approaching data today? And so what practical recommendations do you want to impart to our audience today?
Sure. So I always use the phrase that organizations or company will attempt to protect the data, and the users will give it away, right? So we have to understand, the number one, where our data is, what type of data we maintain, and there used to be this concept of data classification, right? And it still is in many organizations, but we take a look at it and really focus on the data, right, and not the systems per se. But if you can categorize the system where the data resides, you know that no matter what controls that you put in place, that system needs to be protected because this type of data may reside on this system. So whether it's 100 Social Security numbers as an example or 100,000, your risk vector change as far as what impact it could be. But at the end of the day, that data still needs to be protected. So if you take a look at where what's happening within that space, and I think he was alluding to it earlier, if we categorize the type of security incident that's occurring, and say we look at cyber crime, hacktivism, or hobbies, cyber espionage, and cyber warfare, there's a tremendous change of what's occurring. So cybercrime today, if you take a look at the latest statistics, is about 60%, which is climbing over the hack division and all of the other ones put together now. And there's some real motivation into that, right? Because data is worth more than a hardware asset or other assets now, because again, it's financial benefits for someone to be able to exploit or obtain that type of information, and whether it's sensitive or whether it's corporate intellectual property or personal information. So we have to again put in provisions to understand again where the data is, but how we're going to protect it. It's some statistics that is pretty comical. I look at is that if you take a look at what Symantec actually observed, that 70% of social media scams are actually manually shared by other friends, tricking, forwarding out information or scamming to other friends, right? Because they don't realize it's that. So again, the techniques and the way that these perpetrators are in turn, propagating this information is changing as well. So they're almost using us against us. The ideas around cloud service and collaboration tools and how we manage data that's not just sitting within our infrastructure, but are now going out to the cloud. And how do we understand where that is? Because people have personal accounts and then they have corporate accounts and being able to manage all of that. So the ideals around being able to understand what data is important and be able to wrap the appropriate controls and tracking around how that data is being used and where it's located, I think it's critical and key for an organization.
Okay, great. Well, moving on to our next topic, which is talking about threat modeling. So I want to ask Ward, get your take on this first. We've seen that threat modeling has at least three types of general approaches. There's a software-centric start, software-centric approach where you start off with a design of the system, an asset-centric model which starts off from the perspective of assets, and then an attacker-centric model which starts looking at things from the perspective of an attacker, and then evaluate these goals and how you might achieve them. What sort of approach are you in favor of, and why?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one, and actually it was a great topic at RSA this year, because it was really highlighted that you've really got to know what your threat is to your organization and to you and to your enterprise. What is it the threat to your data, and what are the threat actors that you are trying to protect against? If you haven't defined those and you haven't determined them, it's very difficult to actually do a proper and effective threat model. And you'll oftentimes lean more towards what you do know, which is your software or your assets, and trying to do an analysis or a risk assessment or some type of evaluation from an engineering perspective against and focused on your threat models around the assets that you have. But if you can think the other way with the attacker method and define who your threat actors are, define who your concentrated attackers are, then you can actually measure much better and determine what are you trying to protect from, where are you trying to concentrate your time. And it's the old adage of the G.I. Joe, from knowing is half the battle. If you know your adversaries, you can actually determine what protections, what skills, what controls you need to put in place in order to protect, and model against that to best implement the right controls in place.
Well, great. Thank you. Now, a couple of other things that I want to bring up here, just in terms of talking about threat modeling. Now, we've seen there's different models out there, as you mentioned earlier. Now, there's some, on talking about our process here, I found some of the talks from Microsoft were actually very interesting, using this STRIDE model and this DREAD risk ranking model. And very interesting concepts just in terms of how you can identify and rank threats. And I think threat modeling is something that we've seen evolve pretty rapidly over the last few years. And what I'm seeing from our clients is that whereas a few years ago threat modeling was something that was only done by very large organizations, we're seeing it migrate, and threat modeling is now being adopted, into mid-sized organizations. I wouldn't say small organizations. I think the maturity level isn't there yet. But a lot of mid-sized organizations are also doing threat modeling, even if it's just at a sort of high level. For those folks who are interested in exploring more, there's really a really good threat model which talks about application threat modeling, but it's very adaptable to other types of threats as well. OWASP, which you've cited at the bottom, has a link there. Really good model if anyone's interested in taking a look at that. Some really interesting ideas. So we're going to move on here in the interest of time and talk about our next topic, and that is talking about breach management, and in particular talking about resilience. So one of the themes that came out of RSA was almost an acceptance that, or a recognition that a data breach is almost inevitable, or data breaches are inevitable, across all different organizations. It may not be you as a particular organization, but you're definitely going to see that at some level the organizations are going to be breached. So once you have that recognition, then addressing that becomes the issue. So and the theme that came out of it was not so much on incident response per se, but how you can build in resilience into your environment so that the network itself, the applications, and the business processes can adapt themselves to responding to a threat. Joe, do you have an opinion on how to address that from a practical perspective?
Sure. So it goes back to really understanding what your business processes are and what your risks are in the event that an occurrence were to happen from a security incident. So again, I think it's important to understand what's important to your business. It's going back to the old days of business continuity and being able to have that resiliency in place, and then being prepared for it. I think that companies don't do enough time in the preparation side of this in many cases to understand what those are, and then when an instance occurs, they try to figure it out. So I think preparedness and the front end of this and what they were talking about is the most effective means to be able to do that. So some of the things that you would consider in that preparedness is to understand what type of tools is needed, and from a forensics perspective and others to deal with situations like that, to be able to have your CERT teams available to respond as quickly as possible to add to that resiliency, to be able to have maybe external teams, whether that be a external security services or a partner company that you would have, because again you want to gather that information, have that up front, because as an instance occurs, or if it occurs, it's too late in the ball game at that particular point, or it gives you a disadvantage to try to go look for it then. So I think, again, going back to the resilience side is being prepared and understand, what is important to the organization and what is that we need to operate on a continual basis.
Yeah, thank you, Joy. One of the themes, or one of the words at least, that I really love talking about building in resilience is this whole concept of having elasticity and building elasticity into our architecture. And I think a lot of the focus in terms of, if you look at the security triad, confidentiality and integrity and availability, a lot of the focus has been on the availability piece. And from an IT operations perspective also, we're very much focused on availability. Can we keep the systems up and running and having backup and disaster recovery plans to keep the operation running? But if you think about that in terms of how we can adopt that mindset from a security perspective and build in redundancy so that if we suspect certain things happening in the environment, as an example, we can shift that suspicious traffic over into sort of a honeypot type of environment or a honey net environment and isolate it until we have the ability to figure out, is this harmful to us? And once we make that determination, sort of move that back into the mainstream environment so it can continue processing data or doing whatever task it needs to do. And, I really haven't seen a whole lot of software out there that has the ability to do this, and I think this is sort of an evolving area. But one of the things that I have seen in the last couple of years, and we saw this at RSA as well, is the whole concept of software-defined networking. And that may, in fact, be a great catalyst for how we can make our environments more adaptable to respond to breaches. Ward, what's your take on this? Hello?
Yeah, was that directed to Ward?
Yeah, I can't hear him. If he's still on the line, I can't hear him. Yeah, Joe, do you have a take on this?
Oh, well, no, I think you summed it up very well. Is that the idea is that we are used to adopting from a standard response perspective, whether it be disaster recovery in normal systems, but having the same conceptual basis to be applied towards our security as well. And as you mentioned, and not to be redundant in mentioning, I think it's important mentioning is that they don't have a lot of that modeling in place now or software to be able to do. But I think it's definitely an area of focus that organizations can start to look into to see how we build in that security resiliency as well from an availability perspective.
Okay, great. Well, moving on from there, we're going to talk next about another hot topic that came out of RSA, which was how to extend your security team. And I think the idea behind this was how you can co-opt other resources in your environment into providing additional help and really additional mindset and building security and sort of from a bottom perspective up. And the idea behind this whole approach was a recognition that the shortage of cybersecurity professionals is a major issue. So if we need to address that, there's no short-term fix. We can't go and take tens of thousands of kids and shove them through college in the next 6 months so that they're available to get back into the environment. So and help out in the cybersecurity management tasks. So by looking at alternative strategies, the idea was extending your security team and leveraging non-security personnel as security champions or advocates, and even to the extent of turning to managed security providers to supplement their skills. And I think that's becoming more and more important for mid-sized organizations who firstly can't attract talent and also that can't afford to have the breadth of talent that they need to manage the environments. Ward, are you back online?
Yes, sir, I am.
Okay. So what's
your take
Trevor? On this as far as, yeah, we can hear you fine. What's your take on this as far as extending your security team? Do you see this as being something advantageous?
Absolutely. I think this is kind of hits on a lot of what we've been talking about so far is the extension of the security team. We've always taken the approach of security awareness training and instruction and interactive with the employees and the associates and those that throughout the enterprise and organization as our objective of having everyone be a part of security and that view of security awareness. That is changing now. Actually, one of the things that we've done at Home Depot through my team is extending out the testing and analysis, so the DevOps, the SecOps concept. So you have a developer team that it does a developer and a IT operations type role, and now we're getting them into a security operations activity, or at least a security testing and analysis. So we're extending our activities into the development community, into the developer, so that way they have the tools. We're enabling them, instructing them, teaching them, and supporting them in order to actually perform the testing that we would normally, or I would normally have to staff up for and have a team of application pen testers and application and vulnerability assessors and otherwise, and engineers. Now I can extend that. I can limit the size of my team. I can extend my team into the development community and create better partnerships and have them start caring a little bit more about their skin in the game and their activities around my security team and then all the security objectives that we have. And also, it now allows them to be enabled to reduce their security posture and manage their security posture exposure in a much more real, tangible way than they have in the past, where they were always outsourcing, always coming to the security team to be adopted. It was actually one of the things that came out of Chris Young and Intel is that at RSA was that competition is really the largest and biggest security industry holdback right now, is that because we as a security industry aren't doing enough collaboration and cooperation across the industry, not just within our own organizations, but also across the industry, if we would do more collaboration and more cooperation, then we would have a much more significant impact on the security of our teams and our enterprise.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that really is a big part of what InfraGard as an organization is all about, which is sharing information and helping to bring collaboration to security professionals across the U.S. And Joe, what's your take on this? And if you could maybe address something on how folks who maybe have some smaller IT shops or security shops, how they could address this. I think both of you and Ward come from large environments, but how can an organization that's maybe a mid-sized business, how can they take advantage of some of these concepts in extending their security team?
Sure. So I think Ward did a very eloquent job of explaining to how we can utilize current resources within the organization itself to make them part of the overall process. And of course, we know that security is just not the security organization or this group of individuals who just perform security tasks. It involves the entire organization. And we do that through, as mentioned, things like security awareness and defining certain individuals who could be stakeholders within the organization to help facilitate that. However, one thing that I think that's very important is that tools can become available and are available to push out to those individual smaller groups who could utilize them in a very simple way. They may not understand all the aspects about how to read vulnerability reports and so forth, but if they can go through the process, at least running them as they are updating their code or updating the systems, try to figure out most of it, and then have information security get involved in that process and the things they don't understand, it saves a lot of time and effort, and plus it makes them part of the process. One thing that we've actually done that could be applied through smaller companies as well is that we created what we call a technical security committee, and that involves individuals throughout the organization that are developer, system administrators, system engineers, database admins, and really allow them to provide their input because they are in that area of expertise on a continual basis. So by understanding some of what their security needs are and really getting them involved in some of the decision making on how we could better safeguard and protect our systems has been a true advantage. So effectively what we have done is extended our security teams indirectly. Which can be a positive way that the smaller business can even do that as well. And they can also, again, look at, other type of managed services. But if you want to keep it within, find those key stakeholders to be able to assist in some of those processes. You'll be surprised on the input and the cooperation that you'll receive back from them.
Great. Moving on to really our last formal topic for the day, and then we'll get into some of the Q&A questions that have come across. And again, for the folks who are listening in, please go ahead and send us questions. There's some great questions, but keep on sending them through. So on the question of threat detection, we've seen that, firstly, threat detection is still a thing. People still need to do this. We've seen that the visibility, identity, and risks are recognized as being the three pillars of threat detection. But what sort of tools and techniques and processes can help us get better at doing this? Ward, why don't you start off and give us your take?
Yeah, so one of the discussions actually at RSA this year was around threat detection and the different tools that are out there. One of the speaker at the time, I don't remember his name, but it was a highlight that all too often, and I definitely feel this way as well, is that the concentration is across the board. What is the threat? What is your threat, and does this tool meet your threat needs? And I highlighted earlier of have you defined your threat actors? Have you decided that if you are concerned around a nation state type of attacker, or if you're just mainly focused on the cyber criminal, or is your concentration on the script kiddie or the IT pro? Are you concerned about grandmother? All the different activities of those type of threat actors and what it relates to. And unfortunately, there really isn't a easy tool that will define that for you you do have to define it. There's a number of tools out there that will inform you of the active perceived threats, as they say, to your sector, to your business, to your environment, and they're doing measurements off of current intel against entities like yourself, and intel out there available on dark web and otherwise. But you really need to first step back and understand and define what's important to you, and then ask the tool vendors or ask the vendor that you're speaking with, if you're looking for a tool, to say, how do you meet my threats of this kind? Or how do you determine the actors and the events around these activities, and what is the impacts of my concern, and how are you measuring those on a regular basis to report to me, to inform me? Because that's all that is. It's all about intel and informing you of where you need to concentrate your time, because this is the immediate need today, or the immediate need of the current state, because you now know something more than you knew before.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Joe, what's your take?
Yeah, so I think that the identification of the threat is a key component of this as well. So it's not understanding where your threats are, but once you understand where the threats are, how do we remediate them? How do we start to put in tools to be able to identify them? So one of the things that I always advocate around today is maybe taking a look at things like unified threat management. Right. So if you take a look at the next generation firewalls and so forth, if you're not taking a look at that type of technology, there could be some considerations around that could give you some advantages to centralize specific type of threats, to be able to identify what your organization is seeing, so you understand, as Ward said, what your threats are, right, and what targets of those threats would be, but then being able to put some systems in to be able to identify that. And one other point that I would make as well is that before really information security focused from the outside in, right? But we know today that a lot of the compromises are happening from the inside out. So when you're taking a look at your threat modeling, just don't think a look at the actors trying to obtain information through the external source, but take a look on the inside and really understand what is moving out of your organization as well. But I think, being able to take a look at unified threat management would be a big area of consideration when you're taking a look at identifying the threat itself.
Right. All right. So we're sort of getting to the end of our formal presentation and getting to sort of the Q&A part of it. So I want to start off and just do a quick recap on some of the things that we discussed. We spoke about ransomware, how to prepare for a ransomware attack, basically being proactive, not waiting for the ransomware to attack you. So if you can't defend against it, at least have a mitigation strategy in place. We also spoke about how we're still on our back foot playing defense, and how we can implement some of these tools and continue to do things like patching, being a key thing to being defensive. And we spoke about how to reevaluate the value of data retention. So should we be eliminating data from our environment and treating it as a toxic asset rather than something that we want to retain at all costs? Now, we spoke about some new concepts evolving in threat modeling, how more and more companies, even mid-sized businesses, are getting into threat modeling and understanding what the threat vectors are. And then we spoke about also implementing resilience strategies, how we want to look at building in elasticity into our environment. And then also covered talking about extending our security team, and how we can leverage other resources, non-IT security resources in our environment to extend capabilities. And then lastly, we spoke about addressing threat detection capabilities. So moving on to the sort of final part of our presentation, which is looking at the Q&A. So the first question we have is from one of our audience, who says, what are some proactive technologies that are forthcoming? Most solutions at RSA appear to be reactive monitoring and protection rather than proactively securing data, such as encryption. Ward, do you have a take on that?
Yeah, actually, I completely agree with you there, David, that a lot of the concentration is a reactive, and a lot of the solutions and tools out there. The proactiveness is honestly how I look at more of how you're setting up your environment. What are your controls and what are your trusts within your environment? Those are a lot of the proactive measures that I think as security practitioners and professionals that we need to take into consideration is what are the preventative means that we're putting in place in our environment, not necessarily what are the proactive measures as a whole that we're doing to inform or protect against an event from happening. That a lot of that is infrastructure related. There are a number of recent vendors that I'm seeing, though, some here in the Atlanta area and outside that you actually highlight as encryption based, and that is absolutely going to be a consideration of where the data is. We actually at Home Depot, we've implemented encryption through all of our POS devices, so that way the entire life cycle upon swipe, upon dip, is protected, is encrypted, and we're not in control of the full extent of the entire key life cycle that many are out there, and it would create an exposure. So encryption is absolutely a capability that can be leveraged in order to limit. And then you've got the PKI infrastructure, and there's absolutely vendors playing in that space now of looking how to track that data throughout the enterprise, give the keys to the appropriate people, so that way you can decrypt and manage that effectively for your enterprise and for your organization. But that all changes whenever you get into big data and other solutions. So there's a lot of challenges anytime you get into a preventative technology of, is it going to be flexible long enough to be and sustain its preventative functionality for your enterprise?
Well, great. And this question goes out, and I'll ask Joe, you to address this. We had a question on the subject of ransomware and concentrating the risk. And the question really relates to what sort of winning strategies should we be implementing to drive awareness and executive acceptance of strategies that would mitigate ransomware attacks?
Right. Yeah, so I think that we utilize this as just another example. The key terms was around phishing before. I think the execs and people, anyone who opens up a magazine or receives email now understands that concept. I think if we use some of the same basic concepts on that and really emphasize the seriousness of ransomware, but the impact that ransomware has on organization, kind of from the top level, and then pushing that to the organization, I think it provides some real value. The techniques that we use in preventing it, as we said before, we can go through some of the safeguards, and patch management, and making sure you have backups and things of that nature. Those are things you implement, but it still comes back down to the basics, and that is education, awareness, ensuring that we deploy the appropriate communications, in some cases over-communicate on this, because we have enough examples of ransomware and the impacts that it's causing organizations, again, just not at the individual level anymore. We're talking about impacting companies. So I think, it just goes back to some of the basics we talked about before and really emphasizing that to the organization.
Okay, that's great. Well, we have about just a couple more minutes left, so I want to ask one more question, and I want to go back to you, Joe, and ask this. What approach do you recommend for controlling shadow IT organizations that find parts of their business have gone and implemented additional tools and technologies and sometimes breaking security protocols? How do you control this? What sort of strategies do you recommend?
That's a big topic, and sometimes it can be really difficult to control it, because once you open the can of worms, it propagates pretty fast through an organization. So I think what we do is we go back, and as I mentioned before, and that's been a real value of us as well. When you get those individuals who have primary responsibilities around security components in organizations, and bring them as part of a team. So that you can value their opinion or get their opinions on what is that we need as an organization, what tools would allow you to be able to do your job better and implement into that into the overall company strategy. So that way you can create standards through the organization, and by creating standards through the organization, you're able to leverage your resources. So instead of having to support, 5 different platforms of different products, if we can centralize that down to 1 or 2 products and allow those individuals who have those responsibilities to use those products, it really enhances, again, the efficiency, the company's cost savings, and by having them in a form by which you can get their input and know that they are valued, they seem to assist a little bit more in following those corporate strategies and company compliance policies.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I think that's all the time we've got left. So I want to firstly just thank all of our attendees for joining the webinar, and thank you, Ward, for joining us, and Joe, you guys have been great. I think this presentation was fantastic, some really valuable information. So thank you again, and for everyone out there, our next meeting, look out for some information about our next webinar, which is coming up, which is going to be in the middle of May, and we have a great topic, again, a great series of presenters. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.